Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time to talk a little bit more about Star Wars, and we are actually going to be revisiting The Phantom Menace, Episode 1, released in 1998. I did a piece of content on this already, but that piece of content was focused more specifically on the expectations involved with the movie, both the fan expectations leading up to the movie and since it, and how that affected its reception, as well as how those fan expectations when the movie was being made affected what was present in the movie. So with that big conversation, which I think is very important, kind of out of the way, I wanted to deliver a little bit more straightforward review and analysis of this movie. I hadn't actually seen this movie for more than 10 years before I recently rewatched it, and I rewatched it on a very nice audio-visual setup, a really nice big crisp television set on Blu-ray, and I also rewatched it with kids present, and that affects a little bit of the reception of the movie as well. So it was really, I think, very informative for me to go back and look at this movie, having been separated from watching it for a really, really long period of time. And I think eliminated some of my biases of the past and helped me to look a little bit more objectively at the movie and what was present there and what things worked and what things didn't. And I'd like to share those with you. Part of my rating system, as far as assigning numbers, has to do with me breaking things into categories. And the reason that I break things into categories is to help reduce some of my bias and get some more descriptive and real deep analysis of what's going on in the movie. So let's take a look. So the first thing that I always talk about is production. That's the first big category I talk about. Productions includes, all the visual effects, the art, the way it looks, the cinematography, all those sorts of things. And the first category within production is aesthetics. Aesthetics includes all the art that you see, the visual design, the way the ships look, the way the aliens might look, the landscapes. All of that goes into aesthetics. And aesthetics is really generated from a system of design to produce a cool effect for your senses. And I really think that the aesthetics in Episode 1 are definitely its strongest point. In fact, I think the aesthetics are so strong, I would recommend The Phantom Menace to virtually anyone. Even if you have never seen Star Wars or you're not interested in it, it's visually got so much interesting stuff there that I think it's a piece of art that needs to be viewed. I kind of said the same thing about Valerian last year because I felt the same way. It was so imaginative. I think it's worth watching even with, in some cases, some severe flaws. So what we kind of got with aesthetics in this movie, and I'm going to be making a lot of comparisons in this video to the original trilogy, other prequel movies, and of course the movies that followed, as well as both modern and older sci-fi and fantasy movies and high production value movies. So what we got with this movie is we got 7 distinct environments on 3 different planets. More environments and more visual landscapes than we've gotten in any Star Wars movie prior to that, any of the original trilogy, and I think more than what we would get even, I think even Revenge of the Sith has maybe one less distinct environment, but Revenge of the Sith is definitely a visual feast as well. So you had the large metallic ship, that's the Trade Federation ship, which provides a lot of the classic looking aesthetics, but they're new, the production value is new and crisp and clean. And because this story takes place in the Republic before there's been sort of this decay of things into an empire, and you have a rebellion out on the Outer Rim, things look new and shiny and functional and well maintained, but you still get a really good sense of that original visual design in the environments within that first ship that really opens up the movie. You also get a forest when when Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan crash land on the planet. They are in the forest. Then they go to a really, really cool underwater city, which is quite cool to look at, and they go through the center of the earth. All of those things are really, really interesting to see and provide a great backdrop, as well as sort of affecting the aliens that we see there. There's the Naboo city, which is really a very classical set of of architecture, kind of a mixture of both classical architecture and what I would describe as like Renaissance Italian architecture, kind of molded into one sort of unique entity. You also got the desert of Tatooine, which is a familiar set piece from the original trilogy. So George Lucas presented a whole bunch of new stuff and also presented a little bit of the old stuff to sort of draw those connections. And you had this great contrast there between the older kind of busted, broken down, used universe of the original trilogy that you see in Tatooine again in this movie, and then the more refined and well-maintained and sort of height of order and power of the Republic sort of stuff, including the future city of Coruscant, an entire planet city where the Republic sort of lives and breathes in, which would become the Imperial planet later on. So it's really, really a great effect to see all of these environments contrasted with one another. And you also get one more element kind of thrown in, which is the Gungans in their sort of underwater city. They're presented as a marginalized race in this particular movie. And their presence with an underwater city and with their own kind of version of technology is a little bit of an allusion to like the Golden Age savage, which is a concept that goes back to the Romantic period in the 19th century that I think might have been appealing to George Lucas on some level. And I think that that kind of heightens one of the storylines that we'll talk about when we get to the story part of the video. There's also a bunch of new aliens and droids. You get it opened up with new droids and some new aliens that you've never seen. There's really way more than I can even count. This is another piece of aesthetic presentation that George Lucas, I think, really, really wanted to do, and it's one of the strong points of the original trilogy as well. If you go back, you walk into the cantina in Tatooine, and you end up being kind of overwhelmed by how many different kinds of aliens there are. George Lucas really wanted to present, I think, a very racially diverse world in the galaxy of Star Wars. And by racially diverse, I mean different actual species rather than just different looking versions of humans, which you also get in this movie. There's also a bunch of different cool costumes, and the height, sort of the highlight of the costume part of the aesthetics is really Queen Amidala's incredibly different kind of sets of wardrobe and hairstyles that end up going on throughout the movie that really make you look like, oh, this is like the queen of a planet. They're so baroque and so over the top, and there's so many details to them. It really, I think, is really kind of a centerpiece of the aesthetics. There's new ships to look at. Of course, you have the Trade Federation ships, and then you have the Naboo ships, and then you also have all the sort of chaotic mixture of things you get on Tatooine. There's so much new stuff to look at, especially compared to that very first Star Wars movie where on Tatooine you really got two sort of designs. You got like Luke's speeder, you got that crawling thing that the Jawas live in. And then, of course, the Millennium Falcon. So you got like way more stuff than that in this one. And I would describe the entire presentation as what I call Baroque, meaning having a level of detail that is so intense that it can be overwhelming. If you want to imagine like looking at a painting and there's so many different figures drawn in the painting, it takes you an hour to look over every detail of the painting. That's what sort of every scene is like, every set piece is like in the Phantom Menace. It's almost overwhelming, and it's quite good. So I actually give the aesthetics a 10 out of 10. That's a perfect score. And for me, a 10 out of 10 means it's like one of the best I've seen. And having recently watched this again, I can say that the artistic vision that's present in the movie is really beyond what you normally see in movies even today with high production values, really far beyond them, and is worth viewing just for that kind of artistic experience. Everything else could be like 1 out of 10s, and I'd probably still say you should go see the movie or, watch it on Blu-ray simply because of how great the aesthetics are done. Let's take a look at a couple of them. I just thought I'd provide a couple of pictures for you. So here's like the Naboo capital, and you can see just in this one frame, there's an extreme amount of detail. You have a copper roof, but not just a copper roof. It's also weathered. You have waterfalls in the background. You've also got what I think looks like Southern California here in the back, or Central Valley in California, kind of making a landscape that goes to infinity. You've got Of course, you've got Gungans like all doing their own thing, all kinds of different little architectural details present. And this is a pretty brief set of moments as you see them, but you can see the intense level of concentration that went into crafting all of these scenes. It's really something. And we get that same sort of attention to detail throughout the movie. Even when you're on the ground in the city, you get some really great views of the background. You get some really cool views of Tatooine as a large set of architecture rather than what you saw in the original trilogy, which was pretty kind of closed in, just like a street in Mos Eisley. In this case, you get a much broader view of what this planet happens to be like. You also get some really detailed aliens, and these are puppets, not CG aliens. And there was a lot of models, and there was a lot of puppets that were used, lots of practical effects used in all of the prequel movies, as well as CG. And the CG is used pretty effectively to do things that were far beyond the limits of what you could have done 20 years prior with the original movies. And this underwater city, when you first saw it in cinemas, it was really a big impact. And I can say that like on a good high definition display, it still really holds up visually. Now let's talk a little bit about visual effects. So visual effects are different from aesthetics in that the aesthetics focuses on the artistic element. Visual effects has to do with the fidelity and how convincing what you see is. So the first thing is there's a lot of CG characters, and they're used in some cases instead of puppets. And of course, we're thinking of Jar Jar Binks. And while these look really good for the time, and they actually still kind of hold up, I think, compared to most modern CG. In fact, I think most of the CG characters are just as convincing, if not more so, than the CG characters in the brand new Disney Star Wars films. And there's been almost 20 years have passed since these were sort of created. That really kind of says something. But the focus on like the close face of like Jar Jar Binks next to real actors creates a little bit of a division. Jar Jar doesn't end up looking quite as real as he would if he were like an alien in the background of the cantina, rather than something that is needing to be expressive and basically needing to be an actor of himself. And it wasn't really until we saw Gollum in The Lord of the Rings that we were able to have like a close-up CG actor have quite enough detail and impact to be its own sort of actor, if you will. Now, I did mention that they did use models. They used a lot of models in this, and they used a lot of real sets. The idea that there were no real sets in the prequels is just not true. There were lots of physical sets, and there was lots of models used. However, because you have the use of CGI and the way that you can control the cinematography within a computer when you're generating a lot of these special effects scenes, they're very, very seamless. So a lot of people are looking at a model and think it's CG because it's used with other CG and it looks so good. Whereas if you compare it to the original trilogy, a lot of the times the models move in erratic ways or have motion that is unnatural or doesn't fit what's going on because you had to use matte layering and different sorts of techniques, and you couldn't perfectly duplicate a cinema shot so that everything was occurring with the same kind of motion. In this case, you can, so everything's blended a lot better. And the limitations, and I watched this in a very high definition format, the limitations that you notice are things like dust swirling around the ships, not the ships themselves. And maybe that's because we didn't quite have all the particle effects worked out in the late 90s. But that's where I noticed the seams, the stitching in the seams, more so than the actual ships themselves. And if I were to compare this to modern movies, especially the last two Star Wars movies, or the last three Star Wars movies, I would say it's only slightly below par. It really actually does hold up pretty well, and in some cases it's better than them. In fact, I would say it's the visual effects are superior to, say, Rogue One, but I don't think they're superior to The Last Jedi. I think the aesthetics are far superior to The Last Jedi, but the convincingness of the effects is not quite as good. And that's just, you can rate it a bunch of ways. You can look at it as a product of its time. It was very exceptional, but it's still pretty holds up pretty well, especially compared to most modern action movies. The blaster and the lightsaber effects are very, very crisp. They look better than they ever did in the original trilogy. In the original trilogy, you have a lot of stutter with these artificially created things because you were limited into the way that you had to do them. You had to like draw in lightsabers, if you will, or use matte layering, or use stop motion, and those things have a lot more obvious limitations than being able to use CGI to create things like blasters and lightsabers. So they have a much bigger visual impact to me than the original trilogy, and they look great. It's like what you always imagined they were based on how they were represented in the past, which is great. The ships are really, really detailed. I think, if you look at sort of the Imperial ship that kind of looks like an SR-71, it's like highly mirrored. That's kind of an exception. Most of the other ships have like lots of texture to them and lots of things going on, and they're pretty naturally, they have a lot of natural precision, other than the things I noticed. Like if you look closely, you may see like a hover tank going over grass, and if you look at the bottom, that's where you're going to notice some of those seams because the particle effects weren't quite there. The puppets are functional, but they're acted a bit melodramatically. I think visually the puppets at the beginning of the movie looked pretty good, but the actors were kind of like flailing their arms quite a bit, which, they were overacting within their like puppet costumes, which looks a little odd. But if we just look at the aliens by themselves, I think they look really good. The pod race, I want to bring that up as a visual effects. It happens like it's the midpoint of the movie. It's kind of odd and oddly placed, but it's actually really cool. And I noticed that the kids really, really enjoyed the pod race and find it very, very exciting. There's a lot going on in the pod race. It's definitely like a display of extreme visual effects. The final battle I thought was pretty effective, but it was a little undersized compared to Return of the Jedi. The scope was not quite there for like a Star Wars movie, but it was still pretty good. And we got to have a space set as well as like a land set and a lightsaber battle all happening at the same time, which was essentially duplicated in The Force Awakens and in a lot of Star Wars movies as well. And I think that's actually really taken from Return of the Jedi, because you have you have Han and Leia fighting to bring down the Death Star shield while the ships are fighting up above, while Luke is having a face-off with the Emperor, and all those things are happening simultaneously. You have that again, but it's a little bit underwhelming compared to Return of the Jedi. There's just not quite as much going on. It's not quite as intense. The effects are overall more effective than the original trilogy. I know some people will catch flack for this, but I watched the original Star Wars. I watched this one within very short amount of time. And the new effects really are superior in almost every way I can think of. It's not that the old effects don't hold up or they're bad, but there's so much more fidelity with the new stuff that there's so much more that can happen, and it ends up being a much more convincing experience to me. And I mentioned in this little point the recursive effects of fidelity with aesthetics, and I should do its own video on this, but essentially when you raise the fidelity, when you raise the possible detail of a medium, it reveals sometimes the lack of detail in older forms of media. So if you listen to the Beatles on a CD, it may not sound that good. You may realize that the production's not as good as you remembered it from back in the day. But if you put on that Beatles vinyl, all of a sudden it'll sound really, really good. And that's because as you've gone to a higher resolution medium, it reveals some of the missing parts from the analog medium. And I think that is kind of true with the original trilogy. When I go back and I watch, watch the original movies on Blu-ray, I'm very, very aware of the fact that the sets are made out of plastic, and you can see a lot more of the seams, if you will. And the recursive effect is, as you raise fidelity, you also end up wanting to use 100% of that fidelity, 100% of that resolution. Now, if you want to imagine, if you look at keyboard music, going from like the 17th century all the way up to the beginning of the 20th century, as you increase the range of the instrument, composers continue to write all their pieces so that they use the entire range of the instrument. You don't have people that continue to write in the range of Bach in the 19th century very often. What they tend to happen is, as the piano adds more keys, they write pieces that take advantage of the extra high and the extra low keys. So a piece of music that's written in Mozart's time really only uses like 65 of the keys because that's what Mozart had available. You go fast forward 50 years and then you get guys like Franz Liszt using all 88 keys. It's not that Mozart's music is less because it uses less keys, but just giving that extra amount there is going to make you push the limits. And that's kind of what George Lucas did, is he went to the limits of what was available to him at the late 90s, and he went to the limits of what was available to him in the late 70s and early 80s. And you can see the step up in technology really gave it a step up in the effectiveness of those visual effects. So overall, I give it a 9 out of 10. You can still see the seams, but not any more so, I think, than a modern production. Two more elements for production: score and sound design. So the score was written by John Williams, and it uses the older themes in the same operatic style as the newer one. You can hear the Force theme when the Force is at work, and of course you have some of the original opening themes that are present, and you have lots of new material, including Duel of the Fates, which ends up being a very popular piece where Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and Darth Maul are fighting. The mix between the music and the everything else is really clear and balanced. You can hear very clearly what instrument's going on, and the choice of orchestration is really good as well. So overall, I give the score, I give the score a 9.5 out of 10. Then the reason it wouldn't be a 10 out of 10 is that I have Return of the Jedi to compare it to, which to me really was a 10 out of 10 score. There's just, it's still an excellent score. It still is one of the best Star Wars scores you're going to hear. Sound design is everything else that kind of goes into the sound: the balance, the mix, the sound effects, that sort of stuff. The surround sound I thought was really effective. And again, you have this idea where you increase the fidelity of what's available, and that has an effect on what you do. There's big peaks and valleys. So that means things that are loud really pop out and are loud. So when you have a lightsaber moving, it's really loud and in your face. When a blaster goes off, it's suddenly loud and has a big impact. When something explodes, it can be a little bit shocking. This was something that was lacking in Force Awakens, where things were much more compressed and evened out. So because when you end up having that uniform loudness, you lose a lot of the impact of the explosions in an action movie. So all of it was really, really good, and also really balanced. I never had any distortion with the highs on my system, and that wasn't true with The Last Jedi. Their system that I went and saw the movie with was distorting all the time, especially in the high end. And I never lost track of where the dialogue was, or I never had to second guess what was being said, because everything was so well balanced. And then, of course, I give that a 10 out of 10. I think the movie would have a much less impact without that strong supporting sound design, even though it's something people don't think about that often. If you had a really compressed soundtrack over Star Wars, people would be like, I just remember this having a bigger impact. The sound really, really, really does matter. So the overall production stuff, it's an incredible imagination is really the big thing that you need to take away from this, and the higher fidelity of it with the newer technology enhances that, in my opinion. And as you add fidelity, I think these effects actually look better over time, whereas with the original trilogy, when you added fidelity, the effects get somewhat diminished versus like watching them on a VHS. So I already mentioned that they do push the boundaries just like the original trilogy did, and that increased what aesthetic presentation was possible. That big amazing Naboo city that probably wouldn't be able to exist in the original trilogy, because you simply wouldn't be able to create it with the technology at the time and have it be efficient and look convincing. You'd end up looking like little models in Logan's Run. That's like clearly a model train, just wouldn't look very good. So compared to the original trilogy, it's better on the high fidelity mediums. So I mentioned that. And all the production elements really do support the story. And while they support the story, they also provide a sensory experience that I think is worth experiencing. And that's the main thing that I would recommend to anybody that was thinking, like, I've never seen episode 1. It's like, you got to see it. It's a really beautiful movie. It's got a lot of really cool stuff going on visually and with the audio and the music, and that will overcome its flaws in most cases. So overall production score is a 9.6 out of 10. That's a very, very high score, and I do think that is definitely the strong point of the movie. Now, let's move on to story, because story is where we have not only the big flaws of the movie as I see them, but the big objections for most of the people who don't like this movie are placing a special emphasis on the way the story is told and what's going on. So first of all, we got some really cool stuff with the setting. And most movies, I wouldn't include a setting category within the story. But with something like Star Wars, where the big sell of Star Wars as an IP is the setting itself and how that setting ends up being exposed in the movies, the fact that people collect like X-Wings, all the different ships that are shown in Star Wars, shows that the setting is very, very important with Star Wars, just as it would be in, say, Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. The setting is its own thing and should be evaluated on its own merits. So what we got with the setting in episode 1 was a huge expansion of lore compared to the older movies. And remember, we'd had years of extended universe stuff happening between Return of the Jedi and the release of this that probably, pushed George Lucas or inspired him somehow. Though it is said that he had all of this original stuff in mind in the back of his head and written down prior to beginning the very first Star Wars movie. So we get a whole bunch of stuff. We get the Jedi Council, which was really interesting. We've never seen a Council of Jedi or how the Jedi were organized. We just know that they existed in the past. So it was really cool to see them sort of up and running and having them express their values and interact with one another and show how their sort of governance works. We also get the rebellious Grey Jedi's opposition to that. That is Qui-Gon Jinn. And that is also going to be a foreshadowing of the conflicts of what's going to happen within the council, because Qui-Gon doesn't really want to adhere to the Jedi Code as strongly as the council does, and they get put in a rather nasty position in the third movie that has a big impact on the way things end up panning out because of their sort of strong sense of ethics and their sort of dispassionate code of conduct. You also get a really, really great exposition of what the Republic actually is. We have in the original trilogy just a mention of the Republic, that the Republic has been swept away, and that happens in the first movie. But we don't really know what that means, so we get to see what the big Senate Council chambers look like. It's massive and overwhelming. We see a huge amount of aliens all representing different planets. I think it was definitely a lot more fitting for what George Lucas had envisioned as far as his galactic setting, rather than a galactic setting populated entirely by humans, which is what you really get with the Disney movies. Is the aliens have really been pushed to the rear so that the human actors can have all of the focus. And you also get some really, really cool exposition into how that bureaucracy affects the power. We get a glimpse with this sort of Trade Federation invasion that the Republic is ineffective and it's weak and ready to fall. We also get the movie show some marginalized races, which are the amphibious Gungans, that don't really have representation in the Senate until after the end of this movie, and then I think Jar Jar is their representative. So they're living on a planet with the humans, but they live literally under the water, like under the surface of them, and don't really want to deal with them and don't have a good opinion of them and don't really have an interaction with the Republic, but have to kind of decide that they're going to ally themselves with the humans and kind of come out of their self-isolation. So we get a relationship between a marginalized group and a large political body, which I think is interesting. We also, at the very beginning of the movie, George Lucas shows this fully empowered Jedi. When we're watching the original trilogy, we're watching, a more machine than man cyborg lightsaber fight against a kid who's had very little training. And that's most of our fights in the movie, and an old man, Obi-Wan Kenobi. We don't see any really like Jedi in their prime, Jedi that are in their full state of power. And so when we get to see that at the beginning of episode 1, I think it's a lot of cool exposition. It's some cool showing of the setting. I think they developed like a new fighting style to be extra flashy for these movies, which I actually enjoyed. Other people are not going to like it as much, but I think that added more to the sort of power of the Jedi, that they were above human. They were superhuman with their use of the Force, which I thought was really, really effective. And then we see it kind of come to a great point in the lightsaber duel between Darth Maul and Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, which I think is possibly the best lightsaber fight in the entire series. There's so much going on. There's so much fluid motion. It's really awesome to watch and look at. And there's also a lot of story that's communicated in that. And you can see my video that's just on that fight if you wish to. And lastly, you do have a little bit more knowledge of the Sith. In the original trilogy, you don't really know much about the Sith at all. You know that there's an Emperor and that Darth Vader serves the Emperor, but you don't really know like what the Sith are. We learn that more through the extended universe set of media, both the video games and the novels, as to what the Sith actually are. So finally in a movie, we get to see a little bit of the Sith, and we have the Jedi Council kind of explain what the Sith are, and that there's always two of them, a master and an apprentice, which fits what happens later in the kind of explains how things are working at the end of Return of the Jedi. It kind of fills that in a little bit. And there are also some oddities with the setting. So one of them is actually the droids as proxy warriors. And I think this kind of removes some of the danger and depth of the original trilogy, but they serve the same function as stormtroopers. They're faceless, which means you can mow them down at will. You don't have to think about their humanity. And that's something I think... I don't know exactly how I feel about it, because the whole point is by dehumanizing the enemy, you're able to kind of blow them up without the violence seeming really extreme, like human-on-human violence. But once we actually see them as robots rather than robot-looking people, it really feels like they're just not very dangerous. Like it's just a bunch of hunk of robots, and you actually defeat the robots by blowing up their control ship, which is a little bit... again, it just kind of shortcuts the tension or the fear of what the battle droids ought to be. And then you have midichlorians. I actually think midichlorians are fine. I didn't have any problem with it. A lot of people didn't like it because it made the Force less mysterious, less mystical. The midichlorians, by the way, are just the interface between you and the Force. It's not like they're not the Force itself, but George needed the midichlorians to have a way of explaining how they knew how powerful Anakin was with the Force, rather than just saying, I sense he's strong. It's like we've objectively tested that he has this insane concentration of these midichlorian living things within his cells, so he can access the Force at a much higher level than even Yoda. And that's important for the messianic portion of the story. So, and then we do have some repetition of some familiar places like Tatooine. I think that was necessary to bring everything sort of together and tie it to the original trilogy, because there's so much new visual stuff presented. So overall, I actually give the story setting portion an 8 out of 10. I thought it was very effective, although we're missing a lot of important stuff with the Sith. We don't have it all kind of spelled out for us, and we could have used a lot more of that. Now let's talk about characters. I'm just going to tell you right away, this is the part of the movie that is weakest, and I think this is the part of the movie that most people are going to complain about when they say that episode 1 sucks. They're going to look at directly the characters, and they're going to make most of their comparisons have to do with what characters are there. So first of all, it was a shortfall in both design and execution. Lots of people will say that the execution was poor, and it was, but there were some decisions made early on in the design that were bound to create characters that people were not going to like. So Anakin as a child comes off as really annoying and unbelievable. We don't really believe that the child has the power that he has. And Jake Lloyd, I know he's had a rough life, maybe as a result of being in Star Wars and people hating him, but Will Wheaton didn't turn out that bad. But he didn't do a very good job acting Anakin, and they gave him a lot of bad dialogue too. So it was like, are you an angel? Yippee! Like it's almost cringe-worthy to watch that. But that was a bad design choice. If they had had an older actor, you probably would have been a lot more convinced by the character of Anakin himself. We also see Anakin doing stuff like building protocol droids and pods on his own, which is something that we don't inherently want to believe about children. There are exceptional children. There's movies about exceptional children that are incredibly smart. But we don't look at most kids and be like, yeah, I totally believe that he would just build a robot as a slave. So it makes the character a little bit just not work right from the get-go. Padme is too far from Anakin in the perception of their ages. for us to really start to believe that there's going to be a romance, and it comes off as kind of creepy and a little pedophilic, even though as far as characters, they're only supposed to be like 5 years apart. But Natalie Portman looks like an adult, and Anakin looks like a little kid, and so it's weird. And even though we can believe the romance a little bit more, I guess, in later movies, having that age differential just kind of short circuits our ability to kind of meaningfully interact with any kind of beginning of a romance story or any kind of friendship that might develop between them. Like, teenage girls don't tend to just really like and respect 8-year-old boys. Obi-Wan, unfortunately, was a sidelined character, which means we're kind of cutting his development arc short for the next 3 movies. I think that was a mistake. He doesn't do anything in the plot. He doesn't act to bring about anything. It's pretty much all Qui-Gon Jinn's show. He does everything to create all the plot outcomes. He is actually the main character. So Qui-Gon Jinn is the protagonist, and he is an impassive paragon, which is not the best choice for a protagonist as far as archetype goes. You really usually want like an everyman, which is Luke Skywalker, which is someone that is young and easily relatable, has a lot of growth potential, is bad at some things and not good at everything, so that everyone can identify with him and kind of root for him as he grows to overcome the challenges, rather than having somebody who's already really, really fully developed, which is Qui-Gon Jinn. He doesn't have much growth to do in the movie, and he doesn't really grow. He just sort of acts through the plot as a full Master Jedi. But I'll talk about why I think George Lucas maybe picked that, because it has to do with the relationship to Return the Jedi. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. We have Jar Jar Binks. Most people really hate Jar Jar Binks. He looks weird. He sounds weird. Ooh, he talks in a funny way. He's generally way more annoying than C-3PO was. C-3PO was very neurotic, and Jar Jar is like a Three Stooges slapstick kind of stupid character. And we tend to sort of like neurotic, kind of nervous comic relief more than we tend to enjoy just flat out stupidity. At least that's me. I say we, I really just mean me, but I think a lot of people are like that as well. Palpatine and Maul are really good characters, but they're very underutilized, so that's a problem. And then you have these comical feeling droids that are like Roger, Roger, and rather than stormtroopers, they're not very scary. Like, the comic relief from the droids comes off as awkward and weird and undercuts all the tension in the movie. So all of those are big negatives for the way the characters were constructed. Going on from there, we had bad dialogue with those characters. We had a lot of what's called expositional dialogue, or what I'll just call it expositional dialogue. Expositional dialogue is where you're explaining the lore through dialogue, and there's almost no other way to do it in a movie, because you don't have access to prose where you can just explain things. So when you pop open a J.R.R. Tolkien book, he can just tell you how the world is. When you read Robert Jordan, he can tell you in the prose how something works without having to do it through dialogue. Dialogue is most of the action of the story, but when you have to explain how the world works through dialogue, sometimes it comes off as stilted and annoying and sometimes boring. And in this case, what we see, like, we have Amidala's, I guess, advisors talking to her, and they're basically explaining things to her that she would already know and that they already know. The Trade Federation is like this. The Republic is like this. That's essentially telling the audience what things are like, rather than telling each other, because they would really already know. What you kind of need in order to do that is like a Connecticut Yankee archetype of character, a character from the outside. And what they could have actually done is had Anakin in some of those scenes to hear that dialogue and ask those questions that we would ask, the same way that the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court would ask the questions a modern person would ask to King Arthur, because King Arthur wouldn't obviously explain everything to his knights because they live in that world and they already know it. So without someone to insert that, the expositional dialogue comes off as a little bit awkward, and there's a lot of it in the movie. And then there's a lot of cringy things like, yippee, are you an angel? Avanta poodoo. You're saying deep doo-doo. Like, the way that a lot of the lines are delivered and the content of the lines ends up being very cringy, especially with a lot of the child actors. And in general, the bad dialogue combined with sort of subpar acting. And unfortunately, Natalie Portman, I don't think she's a bad actress, but she didn't do very well in this particular movie. And I think a lot of that had to do with her youth and then being asked to play like a very strong female queen. It didn't quite jive. She ended up talking in sort of a flat, overly serious kind of fake tone rather than in a more natural sort of girlish way that an actual teenager would kind of talk. So I mentioned Jake Lloyd. An older actor would have delivered his lines a lot better in Jar Jar. I already said enough about him. Qui-Gon's really the standout character. He's the character that's interesting. He's a gray Jedi. He uses the Force basically to his own ends. He kind of opposes the Council and their opinions and doesn't want to follow their rules. He cheats and lies to get away with what he wants. But at the same time, he's not led astray by passion and desire. And I mentioned I would explain this. He's really represents Luke's arrival point at the end of Return of the Jedi. Because Return of the Jedi and Episode 1 kind of have some thematic inversion links to them that I think is kind of interesting to look at. So Luke uses the dark side of the Force essentially to defeat his father, but doesn't become tempted and succumb to it. He's essentially a gray Jedi at the end of Return of the Jedi, and he's also used his powers to deceive, to free his buddy Han at the beginning of the movie. And we see that we have Qui-Gon cheats with the dice. He uses the Force to make the dice roll a certain way. He clearly had, there's some hints that he might have had a plan to use the Force to make Anakin win, but we don't really see that. But the main thing is he tries to use the mind trick to kind of cheat the owner of Anakin and his mom out of the parts, meaning that his version of morality is a little bit more loosey-goosey than what you see from the rest of the Jedi Council in the movie. And I think that's a very interesting thing and gives him a little bit more depth than what the rest of the characters have. And he is the protagonist. This story does have a protagonist. It's actually Qui-Gon because he acts out the entire plot. However, most of the supporting cast either do nothing, or we have too limited view of them, like with Palpatine and Maul, or they're just flat out annoying. And so that ends up, this is my lowest score of the entire day, which is the 3 out of 10 characters. And I think a lot of people, that's a big failure score. I think a lot of people would agree that the characters were weak, although some people are going to obviously disagree with me, and that's okay. Most of the people who are going to complain really hard on the Phantom Menace are going to focus specifically on the characters and the way the characters work, to the exclusion of all other factors that happen to be included in the movie. And part of my system is to eliminate that, what we call focus bias, which is where, like, if you have imagine you have a piano, I'll use another piano analogy. You have a piano, it has 88 keys, one is broken, and as soon as you hit that broken key, you're going to be like, this piano sucks, especially if it's like middle C. But there's all these other keys that work, and if you played in D major, you'd never touch that key anyway. So sometimes we tend to focus to the exclusion of all else on certain specific things that can kind of alter the way that we value things, and that's the point of me breaking down all of these different categories. Next, plot. Plot is the sequence of events and how those work. So the heart of the movie, I think there's a really good story, but for what's going on there's just too many things in a single movie, and it diminishes each one of the individual little storylines and eventually diminishes the thing as a whole. Now, if you take some time and you go watch a fan edit of the movie that cuts some of this stuff out, you find a much tighter, more coherent narrative, because it's not only is there not enough time to see these, but it gets confusing to try to switch between all of these different little stories and keep them all going and kind of keep them in your head while there's things blowing up in your face. So the first one was the opening A story, which concludes at the end of the movie, which is the Trade Federation instigating an unjust war. You have marginalized Gungans coming to ally themselves with the human Naboo in order to overcome a mutual enemy, kind of coming out of their marginalized hideaway. You have the discovery of Anakin as a chosen one and his liberation. The messianic importance of his character is a major story, but that story is not really connected to those other two stories very well. It's just kind of shoehorned in there. You have a corruption of government through bureaucracy. That's Palpatine's story, and how he uses that corruption both to create the war on Naboo and then to resolve it by empowering himself. And that's going to be an important theme for the rest of the prequels, is that temptation of power and how you want to use power to order things correctly. But there's a danger in power. That's the ring of power thing. So he uses his political machinations to seize the chancellorship. You do have a story about the Sith and the return of the Sith and what they are and what the Jedi Council is going to do about them. And then, of course, you have the very beginnings of a romance between Anakin and Padme going on. The big problem with the plot is that the plot points which are most crucial for the future movies, to put this in context, are those that tend to be the most poorly executed, to receive the least amount of time, or tend to be cut short. So I mentioned Anakin was kind of shoehorned in to this plot around corruption of power and this unjust war. He doesn't really have anything to do with it. He's just sort of a chance encounter. And I think if you had done things a little bit differently, he could have been more present in that, or could have been in much bigger focus. He's really the B story, but we don't get a good grasp of him until almost the midpoint of the movie, after the first plot point, and we really need to have him introduced earlier. He really probably should have been a focus as a protagonist and been an older character. He could have been on Naboo and like a hotshot pilot that is trying to figure out what to do with this war, and then eventually discovers that he's, the chosen one. Would have been a lot better than having him kind of way over on Tatooine, and we got to get there somehow, and by fate we meet him, and then we have to free him. There's a big portion of the movie in the midpoint that revolves around buying Anakin's freedom with Qui-Gon, and he even cheats with like the dice and stuff to get this gambling thing so that Anakin will win this pod race and Qui-Gon will free him. But what we should recognize is that nobody in the audience is going to object to you stealing slaves. Qui-Gon could have stolen the slaves and everyone would be like, great, he freed slaves. There's no problem with freeing slaves. So the fact that he leaves his mother behind and takes Anakin is actually kind of weird and very bizarre and kind of inhuman. What would have been more convincing is if he figured out some way to win the pod race and get the parts, and then, or could have just traded the pod for the parts and then stolen the slaves or something. Then the audience would still approve. You wouldn't have the pod race scene, which I think George Lucas wanted to have a pod race scene more than he wanted a plot to make sense. But the whole idea that you can't, and then of course we have to have his mom remain on Tatooine so that you can have this big tragic event in episode 2, but none of that really makes sense. Like, we look at a bunch of slaves. We had the same thing in episode 8 where like they don't free the slaves. It's like, slavery is really bad. Like, can we have a story where someone encounters slaves and like has a moral judgment about it? And it's like, I'm a slave, I can't leave. It's like, well, let me buy your freedom. It's like, you can leave. We'll take you. We have a spaceship. We're leaving the planet on a spaceship. Get in it and you'll be free after we leave here. That's would have made a lot of sense. The Anakin resolves the A story, which is this unjust war, by accident, which is a big no. You don't want him to accidentally win the war. So he gets in a ship, it autopilots off, he flies to the control ship and accidentally blows it up. Now, George Lucas had this because Anakin's already kind of an overpowered character in this movie, and having him as a boy, as an 8-year-old boy, blow up the like equivalent of the Death Star in this movie would have been just way beyond the pale, like way beyond what people were able to accept. And I think George knew that, and he pulled back on it and made it like an accident. But it doesn't come off as funny, and it doesn't come off as believable either. It's just cringy. So I think that was a big mistake, and I think if you'd cut Anakin doing that, and I think there's some fan edits that just show the Naboo pilots blowing up the Trade Federation droid control ship, I think it would come off a lot better. So we also know right away who Palpatine is. And although it's presented as a mystery, I think everybody, I did, I guessed it when I first saw the guy. I'm like, oh, there's the Emperor, right? It'll be interesting to see how this works. So it would have been a little bit more informative if we'd had his more of the machinations, more of the Sith Lord, and had cut, like the Gungans or something, or cut some of the Anakin Skywalker weirdness of trying to free him, and that would have made a much stronger movie. And then lastly, or not lastly, but we had the romance between Anakin and Padme. It's awkward, acted poorly. It's creepy at some time, and that's mostly due to the age choice of the actors. But the execution of it, it's also very odd, where they're having these kind of conversations that just really don't show much about either of them and don't move the plot forward at all. It's just a big misstep in terms of story. And usually you have your romance story as a B story that resolves the A story. You didn't have it in this one. And Darth Maul dies without doing much of anything. Darth Maul doesn't really enact any of the plot, and then he fights Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and dies, and so we're left with a villain that doesn't do much. So overall, I give the story a 6 out of 10. That is a passable score, and that's because there's enough interesting stuff in the plot at the heart of it that's a good story, but the execution and some of the choices with it are so poor that it really can't get a score higher above 6. You might rate it even lower, but I think there's enough interesting stuff at the plot for me to give it a 6 out of 10. It's passable. I understand what's going on. If you watch a fan edit, you might have an even higher opinion of what story was possible there. Some other thoughts with the story. So I mentioned this movie was thematically linked to Return of the Jedi. So what you will kind of see with these movies as you link up the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy is that they're kind of inversions of each other. So rather than going with Return of the Jedi, you have the restoration of light. And with this, you have it beginning with light and beginning to descend into darkness. We have the seeds of darkness growing. So that kind of linkage is really, really apparent right there. We also have the main character, Luke Skywalker, as a full-fledged Jedi, sort of arriving at his moment of power in Return of the Jedi, compared with Qui-Gon Jinn, a full-powered gray Jedi. And they're both gray Jedi. They aren't fully light side. They don't have a full respect for the Jedi Order. Even Luke demonstrated that in Empire Strikes Back when he leaves his training early. And he demonstrates it in a bunch of things at the movie, including the way he defeats Darth Vader. And we have Qui-Gon demonstrate the same thing with his machinations on Tatooine. We have, at the end of the movie, a villain that's killed by being thrown down a shaft. We have a father figure, Qui-Gon, who dies and passes his power and role over to Obi-Wan, while Vader dies and passes his sort of power over to Luke. So the father, we have this theme of the father giving way to the son, the older giving way to the younger to begin the next part of the story. So as Qui-Gon dies, he gives the next part of the story over to Obi-Wan, who ends up becoming Anakin's sort of master, the person who, Anakin becomes his apprentice, which is really important. So we can see that kind of inversion there. You have Palpatine gaining power by playing both sides, and at the end of Return of the Jedi, he dies because he is in turn betrayed, because he did not see that his apprentice would actually turn on him and would go back to the light side. So his apprentice was in essence playing both sides, although Palpatine couldn't see it, and to an extent Vader couldn't see it either. I mentioned Qui-Gon is a gray Jedi Master, and is a reflection of Luke, and I talked about all those things. The only thing I didn't mention prior to this was Qui-Gon during the lightsaber battle. You can see him exhibit this. Very important thing about his sort of balance of the Force is that there's this part where these force fields come up between Darth Maul and between Qui-Gon, and Qui-Gon kneels down and begins to meditate and calm himself and becomes centered and focused on what he has to do, while Darth Maul is like this prowling lion wanting to attack him. And it's a great contrast between the Jedi and the Sith, but with Qui-Gon's sort of balance of things, he's more calm, more accepting of the fate that waits on the other side of that force field, which is his probable death, than the Sith Lord is of his fate, which is also to die. And it's kind of an interesting couple of moments that you'll see at the end of the movie, and I do recommend you pay attention to them. And then we also have, victory. Victory happens with the help of a little heated race that is outside the human dynamic. So the Ewoks help the humans to overcome the Empire on the ground war, and in this case, you have the Gungans help the Naboo to overcome the Trade Federation droids on the ground, while the humans sort of fight up in space. And then this is an interesting thing. Jar Jar, one of the most hated characters, and I'll mention, by the way, that kids tend to like Jar Jar, and it turns out my wife really likes Jar Jar, and I love her no matter what. So I love Jar Jar too, I guess. So Jar Jar, I kind of find him annoying, but I get that some people actually don't find him annoying and do find him funny. So Jar Jar is the one on the hero's journey. You can see that he goes from this bumbling outcast to a war hero at the end of the movie, and then moves on to becoming a senator. That's a little bit weird, and that's another thing. Rather than having this really relatable, admirable character in a sense of Luke, we have this bumbling idiot going on his hero's journey, rather than the protagonist. The protagonist isn't even on a hero's journey. That's Qui-Gon. And then, of course, you have in the darkest hour, the Messiah is born, which is Luke being born at the beginning. He's born at the beginning of the Empire, literally at the end of Revenge of the Sith. He's born, and he comes of age in Episode 4, and then finally overcomes everything to restore light. So the Messiah is born on the, this is why we celebrate Christmas in winter. So the Messiah is born in the darkest part of the year. And so the devil is also born from the light. Darth Vader in this case, is beginning on this, where the Republic is still intact, and this beacon of light, although it's weak and ready to fall. We have Vader essentially be born into this and begin to come of age. And he brings the light back into the darkness, just like how Lucifer was considered the angel of light and becomes the Christian Satan, becomes the Christian devil. So we have this descent from representing true light, being fully enveloped in goodness, going to complete darkness. And that's, I think that's one of the reasons that George Lucas picked a child actor, or wanted to show Anakin as a child. He wanted to see him as completely innocent. I think it would have been better to show him as completely good and then going to completely evil. That's my opinion. And this is one last little point, is non-native English speakers seem to enjoy this movie a lot more than native English speakers do, and I think that's true of the entire prequels. So people outside of the United States tend to like the prequels a lot more than people in the United States, and I think that has to do with some of our perceptions of the acting and the way the actors are delivering their lines in English rather than the content of the lines or the meaning of the dialogue. And that's an interesting thing to think about, because there's extra information contained in the things we say and the way we say them that is different from the meaning of the words themselves. And as soon as you have that layer of translation, you start to focus just on the meaning of the words themselves. If I watched like a Japanese movie and it's subtitled, I can't rate the quality of the Japanese acting. All I can do is rate the content of what they're saying, and that's an interesting thing to think about. So overall, story score ends up being about a 5.6 out of 10. That is a failing score for all the reasons that I talked about. Even though the setting was very good, the plot was not executed very well, and the characters were overall pretty bad. So general effect, this is my last category. This is how I just kind of felt about the movie and what effect I felt like it had on me. So I thought it was a mixture of two kinds of movies that really didn't stick very well together. One was about politics and war, and the other one was a kid's action movie. And those two things are too diverse, I think, to kind of be contained in one movie. And that's kind of ironed out in the movies that followed this one. So that's one big point against it. I think the aesthetics alone make the movie really a must-see. It's quite something to look at all on its own. If you were to mute all the dialogue or hear it in Japanese and subtitled, I think a lot of people would forgive a lot more of the acting and enjoy the visuals of what they're being presented with. And it's way more fun to watch with kids, because kids laugh at Jar Jar, they laugh at Anakin, they are more excited by what's going on. I know that sounds like a weird thing, but who you watch a movie with can affect and make you think about, maybe Jar Jar is a little funny, maybe he's just not funny to me. There's some poor decisions in the format of the story, and then some weak execution with the dialogue and weak execution with acting. Really made the movie much worse for me, because the characters, the main thing that you attach to in a story, weren't really drawn out very well. And so a better execution of the same elements, and I talked about this in my expectations video, would have made a much better movie. And I still think the movie is a big technical achievement. I still think it holds up to this day, especially on high fidelity formatting, and it holds up in the visual and audio department very well. One last thing I will add is that I watched the Blu-ray version, which replaces the original Puppet Yoda from the theatrical release and the DVDs and VHSs, replaces that Puppet Yoda with a CG Yoda. Having compared both side by side, I approve of that change. Because of the increased fidelity and depth of what's going on and the technical fidelity of the movie, I think the Puppet Yoda looked out of place and weird, whereas the CG Yoda looked like he fit. And he also was consistent with his look with the rest of the movies, which is also important. I think if you go and you look at the puppet in the original movies, I think he looks fine, but you're also dealing with a much more limited technical space. As soon as you expand those limits, then it's more obvious when something doesn't quite fit in with the norm there. It doesn't look quite as well as it ought to look. So that's my last little thing. Overall, I think it was a 6 out of 10. It was passable. The stuff that was bad, to me, doesn't outweigh the stuff that was good. The stuff that was good outweighs the stuff that was bad, and that's the visual, the sound design, and the lore especially. So overall, the score, this is an average of everything. It's a 7 out of 10. That is a passing score for me. Although I think it's actually the worst of the original 6 movies, I still think there's a lot to it. Now, I didn't expect this score to be as high as it was, but I applied my system and I applied my standards, and this is the score I came out with. And I think this is because it helps me eliminate some of that focus bias. If you focus entirely on how much you dislike certain characters, you're going to ignore how beautiful it looks. You're going to ignore how cool the blasters are. You're also going to ignore the depth of the lore. You're going to ignore the cool environments that are shown and the aesthetic presentation. You're going to ignore some of the intent of the story and the meaning of the words in lieu of, or and replace them with your revulsion towards the cringy delivery. So overall, it was a 7 out of 10. I do recommend you see the movie, and that is my full analysis. Hopefully that has been a little bit informative for you, and that you've enjoyed this a little bit. I do appreciate you watching, and I hope you will leave me your thoughts down below about what things you thought were good about the movie, redeemable, what things happen to be bad with the movie, and give me your opinion on it, and tell me if my evaluation of these different categories ought to be different, or if I ought to maybe weight them a little bit differently to give an appropriate score. But that's the score I came out with when I apply my standards. That means it's passing, and the good definitely outweighs the bad. Thank you so much, and I will see you guys next time.